French President Emmanuel Macron, re-elected for a second term, is a supporter of the development of nuclear energy, and France itself is a leader in the development of peaceful atom in Europe. However, the country's nuclear power plant fleet is becoming obsolete and needs a reboot. That is what Macron is trying to do. Last autumn, he said that for the first time in a decade, France is going to resume the construction of nuclear power plants. And at the beginning of this year, he specified the task. France is going to build 14 new nuclear power units by the middle of the century. According to him, this is an important stage on the way to France's energy independence, on the way to stabilize electricity prices and on the way to reduce emissions. Note that this was said even before the Russian war in Ukraine, which only strengthened Europe's intention to abandon Russian oil and gas, and incredibly exacerbated the issue of energy security. This statement by Macron is reminiscent of the actual launch of the program that began the path of nuclear energy in France. In the 1970s, against the background of the energy and oil crisis, for the country's independence from foreign fuel supplies, it was decided to rely on the development of nuclear energy in France. As a result, the country has become one of the world leaders in nuclear energy and industry. There are now 58 nuclear power units operating in France. This is the second largest nuclear power plant fleet after the United States. The share of nuclear energy is about 70%. And the most interesting thing is that it was all done in a very short time. France built 70% of its nuclear power in just 10 years. From 1979 to 1989, the capacity of their nuclear power plants increased from 8 to 52 gigawatts, that is, more than 6 times. The example of France shows that nuclear energy allows in a fairly short time to radically change the country's energy sector, dramatically reduce emissions, while creating reliable sources of electricity that do not depend on either the weather or changes in hydrocarbon prices. Trying the same kind of energy system change, but with only solar and wind power plants that Germany is trying to do, so far cannot show the same results. Neither in terms of the speed of change, nor in terms of the achieved indicators. The share of renewable sources in the energy balance of Germany is already about 40%. But emissions per kilowatt-hour are still several times higher than in France. Because, abandoning the atom, Germany continues to burn coal and gas. France, along with the UK, are European leaders in promoting the idea of developing nuclear energy, and together with them, at least 10 European countries are in favor of this. Another important point in Macron's speech. He specifically emphasized that the planned construction will be the first construction of a new nuclear power plant in France in a decade. It's true. The last time a new nuclear power plant was built in France was at the end of 2007, more than 15 years ago. This was the Flamanville 3 nuclear power plant, which is still not actually completed. Speaking for the whole of Europe, well, not counting the launches of nuclear power plants in Russia and Belarus, the last time a new nuclear power plant was launched in Europe was also 15 years ago. In the same year 2007 it was the launch of the Cernavodă nuclear power plant in Romania with a Canadian CANDU reactor. But in principle, new large power units in Europe are now beginning to be built. In 2018 and 2019, the construction of 2 units of the Hinkley Point C nuclear power plant in the UK began. By the way, it is France that builds them. But I will talk about them a little later. The main new reactor for future nuclear power plants in France should be the EPR-1600 reactor, or its improved modification, EPR-2. EPR stands for European Pressurized Reactor, that is, the European Pressurized Water Reactor, although in the case of the export version, the first letter E stands for evolution. By type, this is a classic PWR, with an electric power of about 1650 megawatts. This is the most powerful nuclear power unit in the world. The closest to the operating power units have a capacity of about 1,500 megawatts, and these are just the descendants of the EPR, the European N4 reactors, on the basis of which it was designed. Speaking of design, the word European in the name is not accidental. Initially it was a joint German-French project developed by the companies Framatome of the Areva Group and the German Siemens. This is the first European 3+ generation reactor. About the generation of reactors, it will probably be necessary to make a separate video. But let me explain that what is now being built is mainly reactors of the 3rd generation, and even generation 3+, which have additional post-Fukushima safety requirements. In general, Generation 3 differs from its predecessors in greater fuel efficiency, better economic performance in both construction and operation, and improved safety systems. Specifically, if we talk about EPR, then it should use 17% less uranium, be able to operate on reprocessed uranium and on a full load of MOX fuel. In the meantime, in France, MOX fuel is loaded into some pressurized water reactors, but only partially, no more than 1/3 of the entire core. EPR can also work effectively in maneuver mode, reducing its power depending on the load in a wide range, from 50% to 100% of power during the day. In addition to improving safety, which reduces the likelihood of severe accidents by orders of magnitude, it has systems for localizing beyond design basis accidents. This means that even if the worst happens and the reactor core is left without cooling, it starts to warm up and melt, as was the case in Fukushima or 3 Mile Island. It has a special core catcher under the reactor to hold the molten fuel. Thus, it should not go beyond the sealed volume of the power unit. In addition, there are hydrogen recombination systems, which also excludes the Fukushima scenario, where the hydrogen formed in the core due to the zirconium steam reaction led to explosions in reactor compartments and radioactive emissions. Here at the EPR there are systems that will utilize this hydrogen if it appears in the reactor compartment. Well, not to mention the fact that they are now developing and gradually introducing tolerant fuel, which should solve exactly the same problem, excluding the steam zirconium reaction. Of course, the unit has a reinforced double concrete case covering the reactor compartment. But it is worth noting that similar systems, in whole or in part, exist in other Generation 3+ reactors. For example, South Korean April 1400, American AP-1000, Chinese Hualong-1 or Russian VVER-1200. But let's go back to France and look at where EPR reactors are being built. They are now being built in France, Finland and the UK, and the first 2 such reactors have already been built in China. The first EPR reactor began to be built in Finland in 2005 at Unit 3 of the Olkiluoto NPP. Fortunately, this spring it was finally launched. It became the first EPR built in Europe. 2 years after the Finnish one, in 2007, the construction of a unit with an EPR reactor began in France itself. This is the 3rd unit of the Flamanville nuclear power plant. And this is the last unit of the nuclear power plant that began to be built in France more than 10 years ago, as Macron said. This unit has unfortunately not yet been completed, but it is expected to happen this or next year. Delays in construction also led to an increase in the cost of stations. They grew from 3.2 billion to more than 12 billion euros, 4 times. That's over $8,000 per kilowatt. In 2018, construction began on the Hinkley Point C nuclear power plant in the UK with 2 EPR-1600 reactor. This is the newest and largest construction of a nuclear power plant in Europe at the current time. 2 power units of the station with a total capacity of more than 3 gigawatts will provide about 7% of the UK's electricity. Its cost is also huge, about $30 billion, or about $9,000 per kilowatt. By the way, the French EDF together with the Chinese company CGNC pay for it. The latter owns about 30% of the project, and the French own 2/3. Hinkley Point C is planned to be handed over by 2026, unless, of course, there are delays. The only EPR-1600s built so far are operating in China. These are 2 units at the Taishan nuclear power plant. They launched in 2018 and 2019. They were also built with a delay and an increase in the estimate by about 60%, but still in the end cheaper and faster than in Europe. Their cost is estimated at half that of European ones, about 6 billion euros per power unit, or about $4,000 per kilowatt of capacity. And this nuclear power plant, by the way, like the British Hinkley Point, is a joint Chinese-French project, but the shares in it are different. Here already 30% belongs to the French EDF, and 70% of the project belongs to Chinese companies. So China, with its massive serial construction, and most importantly, with access to cheap government money, shows that it is possible to build a nuclear power plant much cheaper. I talked about the mass construction of nuclear power plants in China and the results of last year in a separate video. The link to it is now on the screen at the top. According to some estimates, if the construction of Hinkley Point C in the UK had attracted cheaper public money, for example, 2% government bonds, and not private loans with a higher interest rate, then the construction could have cost half as much as in China. That is why the inclusion of nuclear energy in the European taxonomy is so important. This will allow attracting financing to nuclear projects on more attractive terms. Let's get back to technology. France is well aware that the offered prices for its nuclear power units are among the highest on the nuclear market, and is trying to take into account the bitter experience of construction both in France and in Finland, and more successful experience in China. Since 2015, they have been developing an optimized EPR-2 reactor, which should be cheaper both in construction and operation, and perhaps even its power will be reduced. In France, EDF plans to build 6 units in the first place, 2 at 3 sites. Such a combination should also optimize costs. Let's see what happens. By the way, in addition to the plans announced earlier by EDF for 6 new units in France in the near future and for 14 until the middle of the century, the French are discussing construction projects for up to 6 units in India, from 4 to 6 units in Poland, and expect to participate in a tender for the construction of a nuclear power plant in Czech Republic. But again, plans are one thing, but we'll see how it comes out. In any case, we wish the French good luck. Thank you for watching the video to the end. And now you can watch other videos on the channel on nuclear topics. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This will greatly help its development, and then more people will see this information.